despite the many challenges and difficulties which he still faces in doing this. His vision of total peace, putting the implementation of the peace agreement at the heart of his endeavours and promoting dialogues with other groups, is a realistic response to the complex Colombian context. It is also a great pleasure to greet Mr. Diego Tovar, who is participating as the signatory and representative of the Comunes party. We appreciate his leadership and his work as a representative in the Commission for the Follow-up, Promotion and Verification of the Implementation of the Agreement, CV in Spanish. This is the first time that both parties are participating in person in the Security Council, which is a clear reminder of the bilateral nature of the peace agreement. Cooperation between the parties, making use of the architecture established by the agreement, remains essential to make progress with its implementation. I wish also to welcome the recent efforts of both parties when preparing this meeting to examine the state of implementation of the agreement and obstacles which it is facing, as well as identifying priority actions for the next few years. It is encouraging to see the intention of both parties to formulate a rapid response plan to accelerate the implementation of the agreement. I also appreciate the new functions allotted to the new Minister of the Interior to ensure dovetailing with the efforts at implementation by the government. This Council meeting is certainly an opportunity to have a fruitful dialogue with a long-term vision, and also to reiterate the commitment of the United Nations to continue supporting national efforts.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Council, over the years, the continued commitment of both parties, combined with the work of key government and state institutions, have contributed to achieving substantial progress in implementing important aspects of the agreement. I would like to start by recalling the courage demonstrated by the thousands of men and women, former combatants, who willingly lay down their weapons and set about reintegrating into society and the country's political life. It is equally important to mention the work that has been carried out since that time by government officials and agencies to support former FARC EP members and their families. The challenge remains, however, to ensure the sustainability of the reintegration process in the long term, providing adequate housing, access to land, security, as well as to combat stigmatization against them. With inequitable land distribution being one of the root causes of the conflict, the agreement includes within its first chapter on rural reform the provision and formalization of land for the benefit of peasants, rural women, and victims. This is one of the potentially most transformational aspects of the agreement. However, progress had remained stagnant until recently. I congratulate the government led by President Petro for prioritizing the comprehensive rural reform as seen in expanded budgets and the acquisition of land, even if more momentum is needed in order to reach the goal of 3 million hectares established in the peace agreement. I am also encouraged that the government has recently announced a renewed focus on bringing peace dividends to the regions most affected by conflict by investing in the development programs with a territorial focus, PERETS. These programs were launched in the early years of the process following consultations with the participation of over 220,000 citizens. However, while nearly 40,000 of these initiatives have been completed to date, the credibility of the process lies in the successful implementation of all 33,000 proposed by the communities to meet the expectations generated among the population. I also call on the authorities to remain focused on the implementation of the ethnic chapter. The ethnic chapter was a major achievement of the Colombian peace agreement, product of consultation with ethnic groups in recognition of the disproportionate impact of the conflict on their communities. However, implementation continues to lag behind, requiring concerted efforts across state entities, as well as the continued support of the international community. The legislative branch, which has been key to advancing peace implementation since the signing of the agreement, still has an important role to play, including in rural reform. For example, Congress recently approved a bill which incorporates the agrarian jurisdiction into the Colombian judicial framework and defines its structure. However, another important bill to operationalize the jurisdiction is still awaiting action in Congress. This is an example of the importance of all state entities doing their part to advance implementation. Señor Presidente.
President, after the agreement was signed, the absence of violence in the territories was short-lived. In the lack of a decisive effort by the state to fill the vacuums left behind following the laying down of weapons of the former FARC members, there was a gradual expansion of other armed groups, and this expansion continues today. As a result, there are now complex conflict dynamics in various zones, and these affect the everyday lives of communities, particularly indigenous and Afro-Colombian communities. The agreement provides for various tools to tackle the security situation in several regions of the country, including a policy to dismantle illegal armed groups and criminal organizations, a decree which the President has just enacted. The slow implementation of all of the measures on security guarantees provided for in the agreement has contributed also to the persistence of violent phenomena. Recently, following the killing of a well-known social leader, I accompanied the parties to the dialogue with the ELN in their visit to the south of the Bolivar department, an area where the expansion of armed groups and their fight for territorial control is endangering civilians. There, we heard from representatives of organizations and local leaders. I wish to recall here the importance of their work and their resilience to build peace. They clearly called for more security guarantees and social investment, and called for the continuation of the peace talks. This is not surprising in Colombia, since the Colombian people clearly continue to bank on peace. According to the most recent poll by the United Nations in conflict zones, over 80% of the citizens in these areas are in favor of dialogue as the main way to resolve conflict. I am also particularly concerned by the situation in the Cauca department, where there has been a resurgence of the impacts caused to civilians by armed actors. I particularly deplore the attacks with explosives which have led to the loss of life. Even in those places where the ceasefires are not in force, parties to the conflict have the responsibility to abide by international humanitarian law. As the Secretary-General has often said, even conflicts and wars have rules. I regret also the fact that in Miravalle, in the Caquetá department, which this council visited last February, and a place where former combatants were inspiring the world with their rafting ecotourism project, threats from armed groups have meant that they now have had to leave their homes and projects and livelihoods. Insecurity is clearly the main obstacle to reintegration and the success of the peace agreement. Since the signature of the agreement, 421 signatories have been killed. In the face of this, I cannot but reiterate the call from the Secretary-General for all of those involved in the conflict to respect the lives, well-beings and freedoms of communities and those who have opted to tread the path of peace. President, distinguished members of the Council, The complexity of the violent dynamics affecting Colombia require a multifaceted response. The implementation of the agreement must go hand in hand with complementary strategies to deactivate the persistent phenomena of violence. The communities need the implementation of the security guarantees provided for in the agreement against a backdrop of greater state presence, alongside measures for reducing violence agreed upon in the context of the various dialogue initiatives underway between the government and other groups. Undertaking these efforts simultaneously is necessary and strategic to move towards peace. In this regard, the role played by the United Nations aims to foster the development of such simultaneous efforts. Above and beyond the verification and implementation of the 2016 agreement, the United Nations has also responded to the calls by the parties to support the calls by the government and other parties to support the current initiatives at dialogue. In the case of the dialogue between the government and the ELN, we have been assisting them in the important work of their dialogue, which has often shown its ability to reach significant decisions, despite the challenges which are inherent to any negotiating process. Given the current crisis, I encourage the parties to fulfill the expectations of Colombian society and to overcome the current paralysis on the table. It is fundamental for this, for both parties to make decisive steps which will allow the preeminent role of the national dialogue to be re-established and for mutual trust to be restored. As a result of the talks between the government with various parts of the self-proclaimed EMC, territorial development measures are being established in some regions. At the same time, these discussions are also facing significant challenges with the fragmentation of the group and a resurgence of violence in other regions. It is fundamental for the parties to establish a negotiating agenda with a view to transitioning to peace. President, ceasefires are a useful tool in situations of armed conflict, on the one side to contain the violence between the parties and their effects on civilians, and on the other side to allow for trust to be built between them. This is fundamental for any peace process. I wish to underscore the fact that whilst the impact of the bilateral ceasefires are restricted in some regions due to the presence of a proliferation of armed actors, they are a significant step in the right direction. And I take this opportunity to encourage the parties to extend the ceasefires and thus broaden their reach. Finally, I welcome the establishment of the peace dialogues between the national government and the Segunda Italia in Caracas, Venezuela on the 24th of June. And I urge the parties to establish solid foundations so that the process contributes to breaking the cycles of violence which the civilians in particular suffer from and lead to peace in Colombia.
Mr. President, transitional justice lies at the heart of the peace agreement. As the Special Jurisdiction for Peace continues its critical work, differences persist with signatory of the agreement regarding the scope of some of its proceeding. In a joint effort with the guarantor countries, I have sought to foster constructive dialogue between all actors in the search for a solution. This is fundamental for enabling the transitional justice process to continue assisting Colombia in its transition from conflict to peace. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Council, as this Council witnessed during its visit to the country, Colombia's efforts in building peace have been manifold and have yielded some promising dividends, while significant challenges remain. I cannot emphasize enough the urgency of the comprehensive implementation of the 2016 peace agreement as the core task at hand. I am confident that the government led by President Petro will lead a joint effort with all state entities to achieve its far-reaching goals. While this endeavor is essentially Colombian, the support of the international community and of this Council in particular will continue to be of utmost importance. Благодарю вас.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Mr. Ruiz Massieu for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Diego Tovar.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, President. I'm grateful for this opportunity to inform the Security Council about the latest developments on the implementation of the peace agreement in the light of the quarterly report of the Secretary-General on Colombia. It is an honor to attend this session with the President of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, and with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Luis Gilberto Murillo, whom I thank on behalf of thousands of peace signatories for allowing me to brief today as a representative of the High Contracting Party of the peace agreement. I take this opportunity to thank the Security Council and the United Nations for their quarterly and unanimous support for almost 8 years to the historic peace agreement negotiated in Havana. We are particularly grateful to the guarantor countries, the Republic of Cuba and the Kingdom of Norway, for their daily support since the times of the negotiations. President, distinguished members of the Council, this morning saw the inauguration of the Monument for Peace in Colombia, which symbolized our solid commitment as peace signatories to comply with what was agreed upon since we laid down arms. This responsibility requires us to strictly monitor from the bodies created by the agreement the status of its implementation, especially so that all of us who opted, especially for all of us who opted for peace, that is, victims of the social and armed conflict, Afro-Colombian and indigenous communities, LGBTIQ people, social leaders and human rights defenders, inter alia. Taking into account the magnitude of the obstacles and President Petro's ambitious total peace policy, whose main pillar is the comprehensive implementation of the agreement, we would like to make the following observations. President, members of the Council, we believe it is fundamental and urgent to strengthen interinstitutional coordination and reinforce comprehensive state presence in the territories. As agreed in Havana, the peace agreement depends for its comprehensive implementation on the coordinated work of 53 state entities and 15 instances that today are not producing the expected results, almost 8 years since implementation. Just to name a few, which are regularly mentioned by the Council and by the reports of the Secretary-General. The highest level body, the CV, or the Commission for the Monitoring, Promotion and Verification of the Implementation of the Agreement. Also, the Special Instance for Women and Gender, the Ethnic Instance, and the National Reintegration Council, inter alia. President, violence in the territories continues to destroy the lives of entire communities and to further limit the ability of state authorities to fulfill their responsibilities. The involvement of minors in conflict, violence against women in reintegration processes, and members of ethnic communities are a major concern. Clashes between illegal armed groups, in dialogue with the government, generate violence in rural areas and serious obstacles to the implementation of the agreement. The recent forced displacement of the Mira Valley Territorial Area for Training and Reintegration in the Department of Caquetá, following the ultimatum by the dissidents of the self-proclaimed EMC, is emblematic of the lack of implementation of the security guarantees contained in the agreement, and also of the lack of state presence in regions, as well as a precarious reintegration process. We have requested that the protocols agreed upon by the Total Peace Policy with armed groups in dialogue with the state be clearly and forcefully defined to ensure the protection of the life and integrity of the peace signatories, the civilian population, and their organizational processes. We also alerted about the degree of impunity for homicides and other forms of violence that remains very high, no significant results have yet been produced by the Special Investigation Unit of the Prosecutor's Office. The state must fulfill its obligations to the women and men who laid down their weapons in a negotiated solution to decades of war to work for peace. President, distinguished members of the Council, the success of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace lies in its ability to impart justice for the benefit of the numerous victims of the conflict, combined with legal security guarantees that should be provided to the peace signatories, members of the public forces and other authors of the conflict that appear before the jurisdiction. In recent months, we have been able to provide Council members and the State of Colombia with regard to the legal insecurity that creates the jurisdiction. Although today we are still in dialogue with the jurisdiction, no solution has yet materialized. On a positive note, we welcome the state's progress regarding the purchase and delivery of land within the framework of the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform, and recently the approval by Congress of the agrarian jurisdiction. Also, the willingness to update the main implementation roadmap, which we call the Implementation Framework Plan. In the action plan that we have recently delivered to the Colombian government, we detail specific goals so as to show results in the short and medium term. We are at the state's service to continue to work on this and above all to begin to implement it. To conclude, President, distinguished members of the Council, I would like to express my gratitude to the Council for inviting me here and for your continued and decisive support for our peace agreement. Its successful implementation has the potential to build a standard against which current and future peace processes in Colombia and the rest of the world could be measured. We are convinced that with clear will and the Council's valuable support to Colombia, peace will prevail.
I thank Mr. Tovar for his briefing, and I'll give the floor to the President of the Republic of Colombia, His Excellency Mr. Gustavo Petro Urrego.
Gracias.
Thank you, Ambassador, President of the Security Council, Vasily Nebenzia. Permanent representatives of the members of the Security Council, Special Representative of the Secretary General, and Head of the United Nations Verification Mission in Colombia, Carlos Ruiz Massieu, Diego Tovar, representative of the High Contracting Party to this agreement of the FARC, and Secretary General for the United Nations for Peace, Elizabeth Vijar. Civilians, victims of the conflict, whom we've been hearing about recently, and all of those here today. I wished to come because in Colombia there is a lack of clarity regarding this mechanism. It was thought that here the government officials would come along following some kind of diplomatic protocol, a kind of routine visit to the Security Council, and it was not well understood or publicly discussed what the written words meant in the letter of President Santos to the Secretary General of the United Nations and for the 2016 peace agreement, which was presented as a unilateral state declaration, which means this is a state commitment, not that of any particular government, to abide with this commitment made to humanity, which takes on a binding legal meaning, according to lawyers, compulsory in nature, upon the country with its current laws or with a change to those laws if necessary. As stated in the agreement, the peace agreement proposes a national political pact upon all the political and social forces in the country, so as to find a way to change norms if these norms and laws do not allow for the peace agreement to be implemented. This had not been properly understood, and this is why I wanted to come today to show Colombian society the extent of our commitment. As has been said, there has been recent violence in the areas where the peace agreement was signed. The violence has not really expanded in Colombia, it's becoming geographically concentrated. We don't have a national conflict, but we have regional conflicts in the same geographical areas as they have been for many decades. And the question we need to ask ourselves is why? Why is Colombia continually failing in this? We, for 2.5 centuries, have been at war amongst ourselves with different contexts, different global contexts, and the peace agreements we have endeavoured to achieve have failed. Colombia has decades of civil wars in its history and dozens of peace agreements. However, the violence continues to exist. Back in history as well, but also in the present. And the Truth Commission, which resulted from the peace agreement and has presented its work, and this is one of the most important facts of implementation. From the 9th of April 1948, when there was a popular insurrection in Colombia following the assassination of the leader, the social leader, Jorge Ibarrante, who was going to be the president of Colombia. Since then, we've had 700,000 people killed between then and today. 700,000 deaths. There was almost a genocide against certain liberal, political, rural communities during the 20th century. And then this led to the state repression against the armed insurgency, which had resulted from this original conflict and meant that the Colombian state changed. During the Cold War and like other conflicts in the world, it happened in Colombia too, and we have combated insurgents since then with various peace agreements, but in Colombia we have the ELN, an old organization, the National Liberation Army, with whom we have once again begun peace agreements now. But there is even more diffuse violence going on in the same places as we have heard today. These are wars of an illicit economy, I call them, wars of greed. But these are not allowing us to achieve total peace and move into an era of peace, like most of the peoples of the world. In Colombia, it is believed that violence is the norm, and peace is something for elsewhere, for others. Almost a satanic communist pact, what some of the extreme right are saying in Colombia. Peace is seen as something revolutionary. Following the violence for so many generations that we have seen, this is now seen as normal. Violence has increased the illicit economy. Greed has taken violence and used it as an instrument, a way of concentrating capital. And in Colombia, this is done through exclusion and violence. Today, according to statistics, Colombia is the most unequal country in the world, which is why it is violent. Until equality can be built, which means building democracy, violence will continue to replace the peace agreements every time. Now we need to look at how to build this equity, this equality. And according to what we signed in 2016, which is under your custody, efforts were made, perhaps the first effort was made, in fact, since the peace agreement of 1991, which changed Colombia's constitution. Efforts were made to observe one of the factors causing inequality in particular. This is the most unequal societies in the world, then inequality is obviously expressed and manifested in different ways between men and women. Economic inequality between those who have a few people and the many who don't have so much. Ethnic inequality. Indigenous people and the black communities are those who are at the bottom of the poverty pyramid. This is a racist exclusion. Cultural exclusion, cultural inequality between ages. Youth is considered to be a pariah. Even now, hundreds of young people are imprisoned, people who just wanted to protest about their conditions. 3,000 were arrested, 60 killed, and many remained blind because they were shot in the eyes. Just 3 or 4 years ago. There is inequality, which is visible, and this is what I want to focus on, because this is what the 2016 agreement is linked to. And this is linked to our territory. For geographical reasons, Colombia is in a very hot area of the world, and it's divided by 3 ranges, which makes the geography even more difficult than the Balkans, the Caucasus. Very few areas have this specific kind of geography with the mountain ranges, but they are there, and these lead to a great deal of natural diversity and cultural diversity. An empire could never be built with these mountain ranges. Neither the indigenous peoples nor the Spanish could do this, and this leads therefore to a great deal of territorial diversity. Since this is the most socially unequal country in the world, this inequality is then localized in the specific territories. There are a few rich people and others who are very poor. There are distances, as we were able to see in the poorest areas of the country, and those exist in Colombia, and some areas are very rich, like the places around this building. All of these exist within our country, but in different territories, and there is territorial segregation, and that's the point in Colombia. Colombia was unable to solve its problem of violence, which had lasted for over 2.5 centuries, because it was unable to include all its territories in the nation-building process as one democratic nation, which would mean that above and beyond the differences of skin color, social, cultural, and economic differences, we would be able to coexist as one and the same nation with equal powers. And that in Colombia doesn't exist. So the signing of the 2016 peace agreements and the high contracting party, the FARC, who were representatives of the excluded peasants over the 20th century, who were excluded in all ways, and they laid down an agenda, a rather roundabout way, I believe, of including rural people within national development. And the most excluded areas of rural Colombia would be included within national development and democracy. And this is the 2016 peace agreement. This is a reading. There is a reading or a postmodern reading of artificial intelligence here, but this is the resolution of a problem which arises from Colombian history and even during colonial times. Our history of slavery, And feudalism is something that we have not been able to overcome. This is our agenda. So we have these excluded territories, which are called PDETs, Development Programs with a Territorial Focus. We talk about including these excluded areas with a whole number of investments, the health plans, the road plans, pension plans, education plans. Within these territories, there is something which has a particular logic, and it's important for you to analyze that. And this is we call it the PENIS, so sorry about that abbreviation, but it's what came about with the words. And this is part of the PDET, the excluded areas. These programs belong within them. And this is as a result of the exclusion in Colombia of these areas. And then will allow these people to survive. And in order to try to do this, they have they have tried to enter the global economy, but through the illicit side. And this for them is the only way they could find to live or to survive through the illicit economy. There are no contracts involved, no checks, no signatories from a lawyer saying this is how the contract can be resolved if there's any conflict. And so instead, problems are resolved with weapons and with conflict. The 2016 peace agreement put forward a change for illicit economies to be changed into legal economies, hence this PNIS. And this suggested solutions for areas where people were not living in FARC areas. And the agrarian reform was supposed to be to resolve what the Spanish did 2.5 centuries ago through their feudal system of land ownership. We have many, many rural people in our country, but only 1% owns 90% of our fertile land. And this 1% uses the fertile land not to produce food, but to launder the assets of drug trafficking and cause millions of displaced persons and massacres. And this is what the 2016 peace agreement aimed to resolve. So, this agreement is to ensure political, social and economic inclusion of the rural people in Colombia. And what has been the result so far? The peace agreement did not lead to national agreement. It was not possible to achieve a national pact as it talks about, and which was placed before you as a unilateral state declaration, a commitment on the part of Colombia before humanity. It has not been possible because the Colombian people is literally divided, split into two, and has been for the whole of this century. One side who wishes to see a military outcome to the conflict, and the other a negotiated outcome. And there are other forms for this, but this has been expressed electorally. The peace agreement signed with the FARC was turned down in a referendum around half and half, but there were 60,000 votes, majority only, and they said no, it had to be taken down. And the following government by President Santos signed this agreement as a high contracting party and chose to destroy peace. But this was approved following this destruction of peace by an election where I was elected. So there was this political event, and over those 4 years before I was elected, many of the mechanisms of this agreement were overturned. I was elected not by a huge majority, but around by half the population, and a lot of this was thanks to the youth of Colombia, the excluded youth. And we now have this agreement. 2 years have gone by, and we have tried to implement this agreement over those 2 years. And what conclusions do I have now for you today following that? Firstly, the rural reform in Chapter 1 of the agreement was ignored. There are 3 million of hectares for which we're supposed to change land ownership, but only 17,000 changed. My government has 183,000 hectares, which is significant in terms of the previous amounts, but in terms of the speed we're moving, we're a long way from the target. In terms of change of land ownership and formalization,